They said it was only a formality. Looking back, that was the first lie. I was 69 years old when my son Jason and his wife Amber arrived at my house carrying a stack of papers and smiles that felt just a little too rehearsed. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in early spring. The dogwood trees outside my kitchen window had just started blooming, and I was making a pot of soup when their car pulled into the driveway. At first, I thought they were simply stopping by to visit. That had become less common over the years, so I welcomed it. Amber walked in holding a large envelope. Jason followed behind her carrying a box of pastries from a bakery across town. They seemed unusually cheerful. "We brought your favorite," Jason said as he placed the box on the counter. I smiled and thanked him. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. We talked about the weather, rising grocery prices, and a neighbor who had recently moved away. Then Amber slid the envelope onto the kitchen table. "There is one small thing we need your help with," she said. I remember the exact way she said it. Calm, casual, almost practiced. I looked down at the papers. Several pages were clipped together. Legal language covered nearly every line. "What is all this?" I asked. Jason pulled out a chair and sat beside me. "Nothing complicated," he said. "Just paperwork related to the property." Property. The word immediately caught my attention. The house belonged to me. My late husband Harold and I had spent more than 30 years paying for it. Every room carried a memory. Every wall held a piece of our life together. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked. Amber answered before Jason could. "Just something to make future planning easier." Future planning. Another vague phrase. I began reading the first page, but the language was dense and technical. Several sections referred to ownership interests, transfers, and administrative authority. The more I read, the less comfortable I felt. "I do not understand this," I said. Jason leaned forward. "That is exactly why we came. We can explain everything." Yet somehow, they never really did. Every question I asked seemed to receive a different version of the same answer. "It is routine. It is standard. It is only paperwork." At one point, Amber even laughed softly and said, "You worry too much." Maybe I did. Age teaches caution. Experience teaches it even more. Still, there was pressure in the room that afternoon. Not obvious pressure. Nothing dramatic. Just a steady current pushing me toward a decision. Jason kept glancing at his watch. Amber repeatedly pointed to signature lines already marked with sticky notes. The entire process felt rushed. That bothered me. Harold had always believed important documents deserve time and attention. "Never sign something you do not fully understand," he used to say. I thought about those words while staring at the papers. Then I thought about my son sitting beside me. I trusted him. At least I wanted to. Eventually, after nearly an hour, I signed where they indicated. Amber immediately gathered the pages and slipped them back into the envelope. The speed of it surprised me, almost as though she feared I might change my mind if the documents remained on the table any longer. A few minutes later, they left. I stood at the front window watching their car disappear down the street. Something inside me felt unsettled. Not frightened, not angry, just uneasy. That evening, I searched my memory for every detail of the conversation. The smiles, the vague answers, the urgency, the paperwork. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Sitting alone in the quiet house Harold and I built together, I realized one simple fact. Whatever I had signed that afternoon, it was far more important than they had admitted. The changes began so quietly that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. 2 days after Jason and Amber left with the paperwork, Amber called and asked if she could stop by to discuss a few ideas for the house. The way she said it caught my attention immediately. Not my house, just the house. It seemed like a small difference, but words matter, especially when people choose them carefully. Later that afternoon, she arrived carrying a notebook filled with sketches and printed photographs. She spread them across my dining room table and began talking about renovations. New flooring, updated cabinets, different paint colors. At first, I assumed she was simply sharing ideas. Then I noticed something strange. She never once asked what I thought. She spoke as though decisions had already been made. "This wall would look better opened up," she said. "We could replace these windows too." We. The word appeared again and again throughout the conversation. I listened quietly while a familiar feeling settled over me. The same feeling I experienced the afternoon I signed those documents. Something was wrong. A few days later, Jason came by after work. He walked through the house, carrying a tape measure. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled and said he was just checking dimensions. Dimensions for what? He never answered directly. Instead, he changed the subject and asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store. The conversation felt strangely rehearsed. Over the following week, small things continued happening. Amber called a landscaping company and invited them to inspect the property. A contractor stopped by and spent nearly 30 minutes taking notes while standing in my driveway. One afternoon, I overheard Jason discussing market values on the phone while sitting on my back porch. Every incident seemed harmless on its own. Together, they painted a different picture. The house no longer felt like my home. It felt like a project they were preparing to take over. The most unsettling moment came the following Sunday. Jason and Amber invited me to dinner at their house. During dessert, Amber pulled out her phone and began showing photographs of properties in nearby neighborhoods. "This one sold in less than 3 weeks," she said, "and this one received multiple offers." I smiled politely, unsure why she was telling me this. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "The market is still strong. Timing matters." Jason nodded in agreement. Neither of them looked at me when they spoke. Instead, they exchanged a glance that lasted only a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. That night, I drove home beneath a sky filled with stars and replayed every conversation from the past 2 weeks. The renovations, the measurements, the contractors, the discussions about property values. None of it made sense unless they believed something had changed. Sitting alone in my living room, I stared at a framed photograph of Harold on the mantel. He always noticed things other people overlooked. If he were sitting beside me, he would have already reached the same conclusion I was beginning to accept. Whatever those papers contained, Jason and Amber believed they had given them control over my future. And for the first time since signing them, I realized I needed to find out exactly what they thought I had agreed to. The answer arrived when nobody thought I was listening. About a week after that dinner, I stopped by Jason and Amber's house to drop off a casserole. Amber's car was in the driveway, so I assumed she was home. I walked up the front steps and reached for the doorbell. Before I could press it, I heard voices coming from inside. Normally, I would have announced myself immediately. That day, something made me pause. The front window was slightly open, and their conversation drifted outside. I recognized Jason's voice first. "Once everything is finalized, we can move much faster." Amber sounded excited. "I already spoke to the realtor. She thinks we could list it before fall." My hand froze inches from the doorbell. Realtor. List it. For a moment, I wondered if they were discussing another property. Then Amber said something that removed all doubt. "The house is worth more than I expected." There was a brief silence followed by Jason's reply. "Mom does not need a place that large anymore." The words settled heavily in my chest. I stood completely still. Neither of them knew I was there. Neither of them lowered their voices. They spoke freely because they believed the decision had already been made. Amber laughed softly. "At least the paperwork part was easy." Easy. That single word told me more than any document ever could. I stepped away from the door as quietly as possible and returned to my car. My heart was not racing. Strangely, I felt calm. Not because I was happy about what I had heard, but because uncertainty had finally been replaced by clarity. For weeks I had been questioning my instincts. Now I knew those instincts had been right. They believed the house belonged to them. That evening, I sat alone in my living room with a cup of tea growing cold beside me. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked steadily as I replayed every word. "Mom does not need a place that large anymore." It was not the sentence itself that hurt. It was the assumption behind it. Nobody had asked me what I needed. Nobody had asked what I wanted. Decisions were being made about my future as though I were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Around 9 o'clock, I opened a drawer in the dining room cabinet and searched for copies of the documents I had signed. I found nothing. Not a single page. Jason and Amber had taken everything with them that afternoon. That realization bothered me more than ever. Most legitimate paperwork leaves a paper trail. Most honest transactions include copies for everyone involved. Why had they been so eager to remove every page from my house? The next morning, I called Jason and casually asked whether I could have a copy of the documents for my records. There was a pause on the line, just long enough to be noticeable. "Of course," he said. "I will send them over soon." Soon. Another vague answer. Days passed. Nothing arrived. I asked again. This time Amber responded. She claimed the paperwork was being organized and would be available later. More delays. More excuses. Each response confirmed what I already suspected. Whatever was written on those pages, they did not want me examining it closely. By the end of that week, I stopped waiting for answers from them. If I wanted the truth, I would have to find it myself. And deep down, I had a feeling the real story was hiding somewhere they never expected me to look. The place turned out to be a box I had not opened in years. It sat on a shelf in the hall closet behind old photo albums and Christmas decorations. Harold had placed it there shortly before he passed away. I remembered the day clearly because he had looked unusually serious. "Do not throw this away," he told me. "Even if you never need it, keep it." At the time, I assumed it contained insurance papers or tax records. Life became busy after his death, and the box slowly disappeared into the background of my routine. Now, standing in the closet on a quiet Saturday morning, I pulled it down and carried it to the dining room table. Dust covered the lid. The cardboard corners were worn with age. For a few seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. Inside were neatly organized folders, each labeled in Harold's careful handwriting. Insurance, investments, retirement accounts, property records. The last folder immediately caught my attention. I opened it and began reading. At first, the contents seemed ordinary. Deeds, surveys, tax assessments. Then I found a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The letter inside was short. Harold explained that he had reviewed our estate documents several times over the years and wanted to make sure everything remained protected. He wrote that important records were included in the folder and should be reviewed if anything ever seemed unusual regarding ownership of the house. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, my heart was beating faster. Harold rarely left written instructions. When he did, there was always a reason. I continued searching through the folder. Near the bottom, I discovered copies of documents I had never seen before. Some referenced trusts. Others referenced ownership protections and transfer limitations. Much of the language was difficult to understand, but one thing became immediately clear. Harold had worked very hard to make sure the house could not be transferred casually. The more I read, the less the situation made sense. If these documents were valid, how could Jason and Amber believe they controlled the property? Around noon, I called the attorney who had helped Harold update several legal documents years earlier. His office informed me that he had retired, but another attorney from the same firm was now handling former client files. An appointment was available the following Tuesday. I accepted immediately. The weekend passed slowly. Every time I looked at the box, new questions appeared. I reread Harold's letter several times. Certain phrases stood out. Protect what we built. Read everything carefully. Do not let anyone rush you. The words felt less like legal advice and more like a conversation reaching across time. Tuesday finally arrived. I carried the entire folder to the attorney's office. The building had not changed since Harold and I visited it years ago. The receptionist greeted me warmly and escorted me to a conference room. A few minutes later, Attorney Michael Reed entered carrying a notebook. He listened carefully as I explained everything from the papers Jason presented to the conversations I overheard. Then I handed him the folder. Michael spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing the contents without saying much. Occasionally, he underlined something or made a note. Finally, he removed his glasses and looked directly at me. The expression on his face was not concern. It was surprise. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "where exactly did you find these documents?" I explained about the box and Harold's letter. Michael nodded slowly. Then he looked back at the papers before speaking again. "I think your husband anticipated a situation very much like this." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Michael continued studying the documents while I sat across from him, trying to understand what he had just said. Harold had always been careful, but I never considered the possibility that he had prepared for something like this. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. Michael opened one of the folders and slid a document toward me. "Your husband created a structure that placed significant restrictions on any transfer of ownership." I looked down at the page. The legal language was still difficult to follow, but Michael patiently explained each section. Certain approvals were required. Specific conditions had to be met. Most importantly, no simple document signed at a kitchen table could override the protections Harold had established years earlier. A strange mixture of relief and confusion washed over me. Relief because the house might still be protected. Confusion because Jason and Amber seemed so certain of themselves. Michael appeared to be thinking the same thing. "May I ask a question?" he said. "Did they provide you with a copy of what you signed?" I shook my head. "No," he frowned slightly. "That concerns me." He explained that legitimate transactions involving significant property interests normally leave clear records and copies for all parties. The absence of those copies created additional questions. Not answers. Questions. By the time our meeting ended, Michael requested permission to obtain official records and review recent filings connected to the property. I agreed immediately. As I drove home, the world outside my windshield seemed different somehow. The uncertainty that had dominated the past few weeks was beginning to shift. For the first time, someone with legal experience had reviewed the situation and found reasons to be concerned. More importantly, Harold's documents appeared to matter. 2 days later, Michael called. His tone was calm, but there was an energy in his voice that had not been there before. "I have located several filings connected to the property," he said, "and I believe I understand why your son and daughter-in-law are so confident." I sat down at my kitchen table. "Tell me." Michael explained that paperwork had indeed been submitted. Certain documents suggested an attempt to transfer interests connected to the house. On the surface, everything looked official. Signatures appeared where expected. Forms had been filed. Records existed. Yet there was a problem. A very important problem. The filings relied on assumptions that ignored the protections Harold established years earlier. In simple terms, Michael said, the documents they appear to be relying on may not have the legal effect they believe. I closed my eyes for a moment. The realization felt almost unreal. For weeks, Jason and Amber behaved as though ownership had already changed. Contractors visited. Realtors were discussed. Plans were made. Yet the foundation supporting those plans might be far weaker than they realized. That evening, I sat on the back porch watching the sun sink behind the trees. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass from a neighboring yard. Everything looked peaceful. Yet beneath that peace, something important had changed. Fear was beginning to disappear. In its place came patience. Harold's letter rested beside me on a small table. I read it again as the light faded. "Protect what we built." The words no longer felt mysterious. They felt intentional, deliberate, as though he knew one day I might need them. The following morning, another call came from Michael. This time, he sounded genuinely surprised. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "there is one more document in your husband's file. And after reviewing it, I believe the entire situation may turn out very differently than anyone expects." Michael asked me to come to his office the following afternoon. The moment I arrived, I could tell something had changed. The stack of papers on his conference table was larger than before, and several pages were marked with colored tabs. He greeted me warmly, but there was a sense of anticipation in the room. After we sat down, he opened a folder and slid a document toward me. "This is the record I mentioned on the phone," he said. I looked down at the page. It contained legal language, signatures, and references to property protections. Most of it meant very little to me at first glance. Michael pointed to a specific section. "This provision is the key." He explained that years earlier, when Harold updated our estate planning documents, he did much more than prepare a standard will. He established protections designed to prevent anyone from gaining control of the property through a simple transfer document. Certain requirements had to be satisfied. Certain approvals had to exist. Most importantly, any action affecting ownership required compliance with conditions that could not be bypassed by convenience or assumption. I listened carefully as Michael walked me through the details. The more he explained, the clearer the situation became. The papers Jason and Amber presented at my kitchen table may have looked official, but they were built on an understanding of ownership that ignored the protections Harold deliberately created. In practical terms, Michael said, the document they appear to be relying on cannot accomplish what they think it accomplishes. I stared at him for a moment. "You mean it changes nothing?" He nodded slowly. "Based on everything I have reviewed so far, that is correct." A wave of relief moved through me. Not excitement. Relief. For weeks, I had felt as though the ground beneath me was shifting. Every conversation, every contractor visit, every discussion about selling the house carried the same message. They believed they had already won. Now I was learning that the foundation beneath their confidence might not exist at all. Michael continued reviewing additional records. Some came from property filings. Others came from Harold's original estate file. Every piece pointed in the same direction. The protections were valid. The restrictions were active. The assumptions Jason and Amber appeared to be making were unsupported. By the end of the meeting, one truth stood above everything else. The house remained protected exactly as Harold intended. Driving home that evening felt different from every drive I had taken over the previous month. The familiar road seemed lighter somehow. The trees lining the highway looked greener. Even the spring sunlight felt warmer through the windshield. When I arrived home, I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway lined with family photographs. Nothing had changed physically, yet everything felt different. Fear had finally begun to loosen its grip. Over the next several days, I said nothing to Jason or Amber. I answered phone calls normally. I attended family dinners. I listened politely when Amber discussed renovation ideas. The difference was that now I understood something they did not. The certainty they carried was based on a misunderstanding. They believed a signature solved everything. Harold had made sure it did not. One evening, while watering flowers near the front porch, I noticed Jason's truck pulling into the driveway. He stepped out smiling and walked toward me. "Good news," he said. "Things are moving along exactly as planned." I returned the smile. "That is interesting," I replied. He nodded confidently. "Soon everything will be settled." As he spoke, I realized how completely convinced he was. He truly believed the outcome was already decided. I did not argue. I did not challenge him. I simply listened. Because for the first time since this began, I understood something important. The truth was on its way, and when it arrived, it would not need my help to speak for itself. For the next 2 weeks, I followed the same approach Harold would have followed. I stayed calm. I watched. I listened. Most importantly, I said nothing about what Michael had discovered. That silence turned out to be more valuable than any argument I could have made. The less I revealed, the more comfortable Jason and Amber became. Their confidence continued growing. Amber began discussing furniture layouts as though she already owned every room in the house. Jason talked openly about future plans and financial opportunities. They behaved like people standing at the finish line, completely unaware the race had never ended. One Saturday afternoon, they invited me to lunch at a restaurant near the lake. The conversation started normally enough. We discussed weather, family news, and a neighbor who had recently retired. Then Amber pulled out her phone and showed me photographs of a condominium development across town. "These units are very popular with retirees," she said. "Low maintenance. Great location." I studied the pictures without commenting. She continued describing amenities, walking trails, and community activities. Jason nodded enthusiastically. Neither of them directly suggested I move. They did not have to. The implication filled every sentence. I smiled politely and changed the subject. On the drive home, I realized something important. They were no longer planning. They were preparing. In their minds, the outcome had already been decided. A few days later, Michael called with an update. Additional reviews had been completed. Every new document strengthened the same conclusion. Harold's protections remained fully effective. Nothing discovered so far changed that reality. "You are in a stronger position than you realize," Michael said. Hearing those words gave me comfort, but they also reminded me how close I came to believing otherwise. If Harold had not saved those records, if he had not left that letter, I might still be sitting at my kitchen table wondering whether my home had slipped away from me. Later that week, I attended a family barbecue hosted by one of my cousins. Several relatives were there, including Jason and Amber. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed something curious. They seemed unusually eager to discuss future family plans. More than once, Amber referred to changes that would be happening soon. Jason spoke confidently about simplifying responsibilities and moving forward. Most people listening probably thought nothing of it. I noticed every word. Not because I was suspicious anymore, because I understood the story they believed. At one point, while standing near the grill, I overheard Amber telling another relative that everything was finally falling into place. The phrase stayed with me long after the gathering ended. Falling into place. It perfectly captured the confidence both of them carried. That confidence made what happened next almost inevitable. 3 days later, Michael called again. This time, his voice carried a quiet sense of readiness. He explained that enough documentation had been gathered to formally address the ownership questions and clarify the legal reality surrounding the property. A meeting was being scheduled. Relevant records would be reviewed. Necessary parties would be present. The truth would no longer exist only inside file folders and private conversations. It would become impossible to ignore. After ending the call, I sat alone in the living room. Evening sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor Harold installed years ago. I looked around the room and felt something I had not experienced since this situation began. Peace. Not because everything was resolved. Not yet. But because I knew the waiting was nearly over. Jason and Amber still believed they were moving toward a future they had already imagined. They had no idea that the foundation beneath those plans was about to disappear. And for the first time, I found myself thinking not about what they had done, but about how surprised they would be when the truth finally arrived. The meeting took place on a Thursday morning at Michael's office. The sky was overcast when I arrived, and a light rain tapped against the windows of the conference room. Jason and Amber were already there when I entered. Both appeared confident. Amber smiled politely. Jason greeted me as though we were attending an ordinary family discussion. For a moment, I wondered whether they truly believed nothing was wrong. Then I remembered how certain they had been for weeks. In their minds, this meeting was probably just another step toward finalizing plans they thought were already settled. Michael entered carrying several folders and took a seat at the head of the table. The atmosphere changed immediately. Conversations stopped. Smiles faded. Everyone seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. Michael began calmly. He reviewed the property's history, the estate planning documents Harold had established, and the records gathered during the previous several weeks. No accusations were made. No dramatic statements were offered. He simply presented facts. One document after another appeared on the table. Property records, estate filings, trust documents, letters, supporting records. As the presentation continued, I watched Jason carefully. At first, he appeared relaxed. Then he began leaning forward. His expression slowly changed from confidence to concentration. Amber crossed her arms and remained unusually quiet. Eventually, Michael reached the document Harold had created years earlier. He explained the protections built into the property structure and described the conditions required before ownership interests could be altered. Then he explained why those conditions had never been satisfied. The room became very still. Jason looked down at the paperwork in front of him. Amber's eyes moved from page to page. Neither interrupted. Neither challenged what was being presented. The documents spoke more clearly than any argument ever could. Michael continued. He explained that the papers signed in my kitchen did not possess the authority necessary to accomplish the outcome Jason and Amber believed they accomplished. The protections Harold established remained fully active. The ownership structure remained intact. The assumptions supporting future plans were legally unsupported. For several seconds after he finished speaking, nobody said a word. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Somewhere outside, a car passed through a puddle. Ordinary sounds suddenly seemed unusually loud. Finally, Jason cleared his throat. So what exactly does this mean? Michael answered carefully. It means the property remains protected under the structure established by your father. The actions taken did not create the ownership result you believe they created. I looked at my son. For the first time since this entire situation began, the certainty was gone from his face. Not anger. Not hostility. Simply surprise. Genuine surprise. Amber stared down at the table and said nothing. The plans they discussed. The contractors. The realtor conversations. The assumptions. All of it rested on a misunderstanding of documents they never fully understood. As the meeting continued, practical steps were discussed. Records would be updated where necessary. Clarifications would be filed. Questions would be formally resolved. Everything remained professional and calm. When the meeting finally ended, Jason stood slowly and gathered his papers. He looked older than he had a month earlier. More tired. More uncertain. Amber remained quiet as they prepared to leave. Neither offered explanations. Neither offered excuses. They simply walked toward the door. Before leaving, Jason paused briefly and looked back at me. For a moment, it seemed as though he wanted to say something. Then he lowered his eyes and left. The door closed softly behind them. I remained seated for several seconds, staring at Harold's documents resting on the conference table. The truth had finally entered the room, and nothing was the same anymore. The weeks after the meeting passed quietly. There were follow-up filings, administrative corrections, and a handful of legal steps necessary to ensure every record accurately reflected the protections Harold had established years earlier. None of it was dramatic. Most important things in life rarely are. They happen through patience, consistency, and the steady accumulation of truth. By early summer, Everything had been formally clarified. The house remained exactly where Harold intended it to remain. The protections were confirmed. The records were complete. The uncertainty that had shadowed my days for months was finally gone. One afternoon, Michael stopped by the house with the final documents. We sat at the kitchen table where this entire situation had quietly begun. Sunlight streamed through the windows while he reviewed the last pieces of paperwork. When he finished, he closed the folder and smiled. "Mrs. Hayes, everything is in order." I looked down at the documents resting on the table. For several seconds, I simply stared at them. Not because I doubted what they said, because I was thinking about Harold. He had been gone for years, yet somehow he was still protecting me. His planning, his caution, his refusal to leave important matters to chance. Every decision he made years earlier had reached forward through time and preserved what we built together. After Michael left, I walked through the house slowly. The familiar rooms felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, because I no longer saw them through the lens of uncertainty. The kitchen where we shared countless meals. The living room where Harold spent evenings reading. The front porch where we watched summer storms roll across the horizon. Every space carried memories, and every memory remained exactly where it belonged. Jason called several days later. His voice sounded quieter than I remembered, older somehow. We spoke for nearly 20 minutes. There were no arguments, no accusations, no dramatic confrontations. He admitted that he had relied on assumptions he should have questioned. He admitted that he allowed confidence to replace caution. Most importantly, he admitted that he should have spoken to me honestly from the beginning. I listened without interrupting. By the time the conversation ended, I realized something important. The legal issues had been resolved weeks earlier. What remained was something far more complicated. Trust. Documents can be corrected. Records can be updated. Trust moves much more slowly. Amber never called. Perhaps she felt embarrassed. Perhaps she preferred distance. I honestly do not know. Over time, I stopped wondering. Some questions do not need answers in order for life to continue. As summer progressed, I focused on the things that mattered. I planted flowers near the front walkway. I repainted the porch railing. I hosted family dinners for relatives who genuinely wanted to spend time together. Little by little, the house felt alive again. One evening, shortly before sunset, I found Harold's letter resting inside the same folder where I first discovered it. I sat on the porch and read it one final time. The paper had become slightly worn from handling. The handwriting remained as familiar as ever. When I reached the final sentence, I smiled. Harold wrote that a home is not protected by walls, locks, or legal documents alone. It is protected by the people willing to stand for what is right when circumstances become difficult. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, I looked out across the yard we cared for together